I spent 3 years believing I was helping my family through tough times, working 2 jobs while watching my parents pay my brother's rent every month. I told myself it was temporary, that we were all sacrificing for each other, that this was what loving families do. I was 27 years old, exhausted beyond belief, but convinced I was being the responsible daughter they raised me to be. What I discovered they were actually doing behind my back didn't just break my heart. It completely shattered everything I thought I knew about the people who were supposed to love me most. My name is Sarah, and I'm the oldest of 2 children. Growing up, I was always the one who took care of things. When Mom got stressed about bills, I'd quietly slip her $20 from my babysitting money. When Dad's car broke down, I'd research mechanics and call around for quotes. When my brother Jake struggled with math in high school, I spent every evening for months tutoring him through algebra and geometry. This pattern felt normal to me. I was capable, I was reliable, and I genuinely wanted to help the people I loved. Jake, on the other hand, was the baby. 3 years younger than me, he'd always been the one who could charm his way out of trouble with a smile and a joke. Where I was serious and goal-oriented, Jake was laid back and spontaneous. Our parents often said they loved how different we were, how we balanced each other out. I didn't mind being the responsible one. In fact, I took pride in it. I thought it meant I was valued, that my family depended on me because they trusted me. After high school, I went straight to community college while working part-time at a local coffee shop. I paid for my classes myself, taking out small loans only when absolutely necessary. I studied business administration with dreams of eventually getting my bachelor's degree and maybe starting my own consulting firm. Jake took a gap year after graduation, then enrolled in a 4-year university about 2 hours away. My parents covered his tuition, room, and board without question. When I mentioned feeling a little envious, they explained that Jake needed more support because he wasn't as naturally disciplined as I was. They said they knew I'd figure things out on my own because I always did. At the time, this reasoning made sense to me. I had always been self-sufficient, and I was proud of that independence. I told myself that their investment in Jake was practical. He needed more guidance, more structure, more financial support to succeed. I was strong enough to handle things alone. This became a recurring theme in our family dynamic, though I didn't recognize it as such for years. After I finished my associate degree, I transferred to a nearby state university to complete my bachelor's degree. I was working full-time at a marketing firm during the day and taking evening classes, which meant most of my weekends were spent studying or catching up on assignments I couldn't complete during the week. It was exhausting, but I was making progress toward my goals. Jake, meanwhile, had switched majors twice and was taking an extra year to graduate, but my parents continued supporting him financially without complaint. The arrangement that would define the next 3 years of my life began when Jake graduated and moved back home. He'd gotten his degree in communications but was struggling to find work in his field. My parents explained that the job market was tough, especially for recent graduates, and they wanted to help him get established. They found him a nice 1-bedroom apartment across town and offered to pay his rent while he looked for the right opportunity. The rent was $850 a month. At first, I thought this was generous but reasonable. Jake was their child too, and if they had the means to help him transition into adult life, why shouldn't they? I was living at home at the time, saving money while I finished my degree and established myself in my career. I contributed to household expenses and helped with groceries, utilities, and maintenance around the house. I thought we were all contributing in our own ways. The first hint that something was off came about 6 months into this arrangement. I'd just gotten a promotion at work that came with a modest salary increase, and I was excited to share the news at Sunday dinner. When I mentioned my raise, my mother's first response wasn't congratulations. It was a suggestion that I could start contributing more to the household expenses since I was making more money. She specifically mentioned that money was getting tighter for them, especially with Jake's rent to cover every month. This struck me as odd because both of my parents had stable, well-paying jobs. My father worked as a supervisor at a manufacturing plant and had been there for over 15 years. My mother was an administrative assistant at a medical office and had excellent benefits. They'd never had trouble covering their bills before. But I loved my family, and if they needed help, I wanted to provide it. I increased my monthly contribution to the household from $300 to $500. Over the next several months, the requests for help became more frequent and more specific. My mother would mention that groceries were more expensive than expected, and could I pick up the shopping that week? My father would comment that the heating bill was higher than usual, and maybe I could cover utilities for the month. Each request came with a reference to how expensive it was to support Jake while he looked for work, how they were stretching themselves thin to help him get on his feet. I found myself working extra hours whenever possible, taking on freelance projects in the evenings and weekends to meet these increasing financial expectations. When a friend offered me a part-time position doing social media management for her small business, I jumped at the opportunity. Suddenly, I was working my full-time marketing job during the day, doing freelance work in the evenings, and managing social media accounts on weekends. I was exhausted, but I told myself it was temporary. Once Jake found a good job, things would go back to normal. The months stretched on, and Jake's job search seemed to be going nowhere. He'd had a few interviews, but nothing panned out. According to my parents, he was being selective because he wanted to find the right fit, something that would utilize his education and set him up for long-term success. They admired his standards and didn't want him to settle for just any job. Meanwhile, they continued to ask me for increasing amounts of financial help, always framed as temporary assistance until Jake got established. By the end of the first year, I was contributing nearly $800 a month to the household in various forms: increased rent contribution, groceries, utilities, car repairs, and miscellaneous expenses that my parents claimed they couldn't cover because of Jake's rent. I was working close to 60 hours a week between my two jobs and barely had time for social activities or dating. My friends started commenting that they never saw me anymore, that I looked tired all the time. I brushed off their concerns, telling them I was building my career and helping my family through a temporary rough patch. The second year was when the resentment started creeping in, though I tried hard to suppress it. Jake had found a part-time job at a local gym, but it barely paid minimum wage and only gave him about 20 hours a week. My parents said this was a good start, but obviously not enough to cover his rent, so they continued their financial support. They praised him for finally getting some work experience and encouraged him to keep looking for something full-time in his field. Meanwhile, my own career was thriving despite my exhaustion. I'd been promoted again and was now managing several key accounts at the marketing firm. My supervisor had mentioned that I was being considered for a senior role that would come with a significant salary increase and potential for equity in the company. But instead of celebrating these achievements, I found myself calculating how much more I'd be able to contribute to the family expenses. The breaking point in my perception came during a conversation with my mother about Jake's living situation. I'd mentioned that 3 years seemed like a long time to be supporting someone who was capable of working, and maybe Jake should consider getting a roommate to reduce expenses or moving back home temporarily to save money. My mother's response was sharp and defensive. She told me that not everyone was as driven and self-sufficient as I was, that Jake needed more support and understanding. She said I'd always been the strong one, the one who could handle anything, and that meant I had a responsibility to help the family members who weren't as capable. This conversation planted a seed of doubt that grew over the following months. I started paying closer attention to the family dynamics, particularly around money and expectations. I noticed that when Jake needed something, new clothes for interviews, car repairs, even entertainment expenses, it was simply provided without question. When I needed something, even something work-related like professional development courses or networking events, the response was always about whether it was really necessary and couldn't I find a cheaper alternative. The pattern became impossible to ignore during the third year. By this point, I was working my full-time marketing job, managing social media for 3 different small businesses, and had taken on additional freelance projects doing website development. I was working 7 days a week and contributing over $1,000 a month to various family expenses. I'd had to turn down multiple social invitations, skip family gatherings because I was working, and postpone taking any vacation time because I couldn't afford to lose the income. Jake, meanwhile, had quit his gym job because he said it wasn't fulfilling and was interfering with his job search in communications. My parents supported this decision, saying it was better for him to focus on finding the right career opportunity than to waste time in a job that wasn't advancing his goals. They continued paying his rent, and now that he wasn't working at all, they'd also started covering his food expenses and other necessities. The discovery that changed everything happened completely by accident. I was at my parents' house helping my father organize some financial documents for tax preparation when I saw a folder labeled with Jake's name. Inside were bank statements, rent receipts, and other financial records related to his apartment. What I saw made my stomach drop. The rent on Jake's apartment wasn't $850 a month, it was $425. My parents had been lying to me about the cost of his housing for almost 3 years. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was discovering that Jake had been working steadily for the past 18 months at a marketing company downtown, earning $42,000 a year. The gym job story, the continued unemployment, the struggling job search, all of it had been a fabrication. My hands were shaking as I looked through more documents. Jake had been employed full-time for over a year and a half, making a decent salary that was more than enough to cover his actual rent and living expenses. Yet my parents had continued collecting money from me every month, telling me it was to help support him. They'd been using my contributions to supplement their own lifestyle while maintaining the fiction that they were financially strained by supporting their unemployed son. The math was devastating. Over 3 years, I'd contributed approximately $32,000 to the household under the belief that it was necessary to help support Jake. During that same period, my parents had been paying out only about $15,000 in actual rent for his apartment. They'd been profiting from my exhaustion and sacrifice while lying to me about the basic facts of the situation. But the financial deception wasn't even the most painful discovery. As I continued looking through the documents, I found planning materials for a family vacation to Europe that my parents and Jake had taken 6 months earlier. They'd told me they couldn't afford to include me and suggested I was too busy with work anyway. The receipts showed they'd spent over $8,000 on this trip, money that came, at least partially, from my contributions to the household. I felt physically sick as the full scope of the deception became clear. For 3 years, I'd been working myself to exhaustion, sacrificing my social life, my mental health, and my own financial security to support what I thought was a family in need. Instead, I'd been funding my parents' increased lifestyle and enabling them to continue babying my adult brother while he built his own career with a foundation of lies. The confrontation happened that same evening. I stayed for dinner, carrying the weight of this knowledge while trying to appear normal. When my mother made her usual comment about how expensive everything was getting and how much they appreciated my help with household expenses, I couldn't stay silent anymore. I told them I'd seen Jake's financial documents. I laid out exactly what I'd discovered, the real cost of his rent, his actual employment status, and the timeline of their deception. I presented the numbers clearly and calmly, explaining how much I'd contributed versus how much they'd actually needed for Jake's expenses. The reaction was exactly what I should have expected, though it still managed to shock me. Instead of apologizing or showing remorse, my parents became defensive and angry. My father accused me of snooping through private documents. My mother said I was being ungrateful and selfish, that families help each other without keeping score. They claimed that Jake's employment was recent, and that they'd been trying to help him get established without the pressure of immediately taking on all his expenses. When I pointed out that the bank statements clearly showed Jake had been employed for 18 months, my mother's response was that they hadn't told me because they knew I'd stop helping with household expenses. She said this as if it justified the deception, as if my potential decision to reduce my contributions would have been unreasonable once Jake became self-sufficient. The most hurtful part of their response was the complete lack of acknowledgement for what this deception had cost me. They showed no recognition of the sacrifice I'd made, the exhaustion I'd endured, or the opportunities I'd missed because I was working constantly to support what I thought was a family crisis. Instead, they focused on defending their right to Jake's privacy and their decisions as parents. Jake's response, when I called him directly, was somehow even worse. He expressed no surprise that I'd discovered the truth, which told me he'd been fully aware of the deception from the beginning. He was annoyed that I was making a big deal out of it, and suggested that I'd always been controlling about money and family decisions. He said my parents had been trying to protect his privacy and help him transition into independence without my interference. The word interference hit me like a physical blow. My 3 years of sacrifice, my exhaustion and missed opportunities, my genuine desire to help my family, all of it was characterized as interference. The people I loved most in the world had been systematically deceiving me while I worked myself to the bone for their benefit, and their primary concern was that I was now inconveniently aware of the truth. That night, I made a decision that would fundamentally change my relationship with my family. I drafted a detailed email outlining the financial deception, including specific amounts and dates. I calculated the total amount I'd contributed based on false information and requested that it be repaid within 90 days. I also informed them that I would no longer be contributing to household expenses and would be moving out within 30 days. The response to my email was swift and brutal. My mother called me selfish and ungrateful, saying I was destroying the family over money. My father said I was being vindictive and that they'd given me a home when I needed it, so I owed them support in return. Jake accused me of being manipulative and said I was trying to punish them for not including me in every family decision. None of them addressed the fundamental issue, that they'd lied to me for 3 years while I sacrificed my financial security and well-being based on those lies. None of them acknowledged that their deception was wrong or that I had a right to be hurt and angry. Instead, they attacked my character and my motives, painting me as the unreasonable one for expecting honesty and accountability. The next few weeks were some of the most difficult of my life. I found an apartment and moved out of my parents' house, using money I'd been saving for a down payment on a condo. The financial strain was significant because I'd been contributing so much to the household that I hadn't built up the emergency fund I should have had. My parents made the moving process as difficult as possible, alternating between guilt trips and anger, demanding I reconsider my decision. What helped me maintain my resolve was the support I found from unexpected sources. When I shared my story with colleagues and friends, their reactions validated my feelings in a way my family never had. They were shocked by the deception and supportive of my decision to establish boundaries. Several people shared their own stories of family financial manipulation, helping me understand that this pattern was more common than I'd realized. My supervisor at work was particularly supportive when I explained why I needed to reduce my freelance commitments to focus on my mental health and primary career. She revealed that she'd been concerned about my exhaustion and overwork for months, but hadn't wanted to overstep boundaries by commenting on my personal situation. She encouraged me to apply for the senior position I'd been considered for, and when I expressed concern about my emotional state affecting my performance, she arranged for me to access the company's employee assistance program for counseling. The therapy sessions were transformative in helping me understand the dynamics that had made this deception possible. My therapist helped me recognize that my role as the family caretaker had been established early and reinforced consistently throughout my life. The expectation that I would sacrifice for others while receiving little support in return wasn't new. It was a pattern that had been building for decades. Through therapy, I began to understand that my parents' treatment of me wasn't actually about money. It was about power and control. By keeping me financially strained and emotionally exhausted, they maintained a dynamic where I was always dependent on their approval and always striving to prove my worth through sacrifice. Jake's role as the favored child wasn't just about preference. It was about maintaining a system where one child received unconditional support while the other earned love through service. This realization was painful but also liberating. It meant that my worth wasn't determined by how much I could sacrifice or how useful I could be to others. It meant that healthy relationships were based on mutual respect and honesty, not on one person constantly proving their value through service. It meant that I had the right to expect basic honesty and consideration from the people who claimed to love me. 6 months after moving out, I received the promotion I'd been working toward. The senior position came with a substantial salary increase and real decision-making authority within the company. More importantly, it came with the recognition that my skills and dedication were valued by people who didn't take my contributions for granted. For the first time in years, I was working normal hours and had energy for social activities and personal interests. Around the same time, I got unexpected validation about my decision from an unlikely source. A family friend who'd known us for years reached out to tell me she'd always admired how hard I worked and how much I contributed to the family. She said she'd often wondered why my parents seemed to expect so much from me while Jake appeared to coast through life without similar expectations. She'd never felt it was her place to comment, but seeing how my family had reacted to my boundary setting had motivated her to reach out with support. This conversation led to several others with extended family members and family friends who'd observed our dynamics over the years. I learned that my pattern of being the responsible one while Jake was coddled had been obvious to outsiders, though they'd assumed it was just typical sibling differences rather than the systematic favoritism I now recognized it to be. Several people mentioned being surprised that my parents had been struggling financially, since they'd never appeared to reduce their lifestyle or spending habits. The most significant moment of vindication came 8 months after I'd moved out. My company was featured in a local business magazine, and I was interviewed as one of their rising leaders. The article highlighted my work on several successful campaigns and mentioned my recent promotion to senior account manager. It also discussed my plans to pursue an MBA while continuing my career in marketing. My mother saw the article and called me for the first time since I'd moved out. Her tone was different, less defensive and more uncertain. She said she was proud of my success and wanted to know if we could have coffee to talk. I agreed, though I was clear that any conversation would need to include acknowledgement of what had happened and genuine discussion about moving forward. The coffee meeting was awkward but necessary. My mother seemed genuinely surprised by how well I was doing professionally and personally. She admitted that she'd expected me to struggle more after losing the family support system, and my obvious thriving seemed to have shaken some of her assumptions about our relationship dynamics. For the first time, she acknowledged that they probably should have told me about Jake's employment status. She stopped short of calling it deception, framing it instead as a misunderstanding about privacy and family boundaries. She also mentioned that they'd been having their own financial struggles lately and could really use my help with some expenses. This last comment revealed that she still didn't understand the fundamental problem. Even in a conversation meant to address our relationship issues, she was still focused on what I could provide for them, rather than acknowledging the harm their deception had caused me. I realized that any reconciliation would have to be based on very clear boundaries and consistent accountability. I told my mother that I was open to rebuilding our relationship, but it would require several non-negotiable changes. First, complete honesty about family finances and decisions that affected me. Second, recognition that my contributions to the family were voluntary gifts, not obligations or expectations. Third, equal treatment and respect for my time, energy, and resources. Finally, acknowledgement that the 3 years of deception had caused real harm and that rebuilding trust would take time and consistent changed behavior. My mother's response was mixed. She agreed in principle but seemed uncomfortable with the idea that she and my father needed to earn back my trust rather than simply receiving forgiveness and returning to the previous dynamic. She asked if I was planning to hold their mistakes over their heads forever, which showed me that she still viewed accountability as punishment rather than as a foundation for healthy relationships. The conversation with my father was even more challenging. He remained largely defensive, insisting that they'd been trying to help both of their children in different ways, and that I was being unfairly harsh in my judgment. He seemed genuinely unable to understand why I viewed the deception as a serious betrayal rather than a minor family disagreement. He kept returning to the theme that families should support each other without keeping score, completely missing the point that keeping score hadn't been the issue, honesty had been. Jake and I have had no direct contact since the initial confrontation. Through family updates, I've learned that he's still working at the same marketing company and has been promoted to a supervisory role. My parents no longer pay his rent, though whether this change was voluntary or necessitated by their own financial situation isn't clear. He's apparently expressed no interest in apologizing or discussing the situation, which tells me everything I need to know about his character and priorities. The most important outcome of this entire experience has been my changed understanding of family relationships and personal worth. Through therapy and the support of healthy relationships, I've learned that love shouldn't be conditional on service, that respect includes basic honesty, and that boundaries aren't selfish. They're necessary for authentic connection. I've also learned that some people will always prioritize their own comfort over your well-being, even when they claim to love you. This doesn't make them evil, but it does make them unsafe for certain types of relationships. Understanding this has helped me develop more realistic expectations and better boundaries with family members who haven't demonstrated genuine change. 18 months after the initial confrontation, my relationship with my parents exists, but looks very different than it did before. We have occasional dinners and holiday visits, but I no longer provide financial support or emotional caretaking. I share good news about my life, but don't seek their validation or approval. I'm polite but not intimate, present but not available for manipulation. This approach has been challenging for them to accept. They've made several attempts to return to the old dynamic, creating crises or expressing needs that would historically have motivated me to jump in with assistance. When I respond with sympathy but no action, they express disappointment and confusion. They seem genuinely puzzled by my unwillingness to resume my role as the family problem solver and financial safety net. The most telling moment came during a family gathering last Christmas. My aunt mentioned my recent completion of my MBA and asked about my career plans. As I described my goals for potentially starting my own consulting firm, I could see my parents' surprised reactions. They seemed to have no idea that I'd been pursuing additional education or that my career aspirations had evolved beyond my current position. This moment highlighted how little they actually knew about my life and goals beyond my utility to their needs. For years, our conversations had focused on their problems and my solutions, their struggles and my contributions. They'd never invested the same energy in understanding my dreams, supporting my goals, or celebrating my achievements that they'd put into managing Jake's life and protecting his comfort. Recognizing this pattern helped me understand that the financial deception had been a symptom of a much larger problem. They'd never seen me as a full person with my own needs, dreams, and limitations. I'd been valued for what I could provide rather than who I was, and my worth in their eyes had been directly tied to my willingness to sacrifice for their priorities. The business I started 6 months ago is thriving beyond my expectations. I'm specializing in helping small businesses develop authentic marketing strategies that reflect their values and build genuine customer relationships. The irony isn't lost on me that my professional success is built on helping others create honest, value-based connections, while I've had to limit my relationship with my own family due to their inability to operate from those same principles. My personal life has also flourished since establishing boundaries with my family. I'm dating someone who respects my time and energy, who celebrates my successes without trying to benefit from them, and who supports my goals without expecting me to sacrifice them for his comfort. The contrast between this healthy relationship and my family dynamics has been educational and healing. I've also developed friendships with people who've had similar experiences with family financial manipulation and emotional abuse. There's something powerful about being understood by people who've lived through comparable situations. We support each other in maintaining boundaries, celebrating successes, and navigating the complex emotions that come with limiting relationships with family members who haven't demonstrated genuine change. One of the most surprising aspects of this journey has been discovering how common these dynamics are. When I share my story, either personally or through speaking at events about workplace family boundaries, I'm consistently amazed by how many people approach me afterward with similar experiences. The details vary, but the patterns are remarkably consistent. One family member expected to sacrifice while others receive unconditional support, financial manipulation disguised as family loyalty, and resistance to accountability when the unfairness is exposed. This recognition has motivated me to be more open about my experience and to offer support to others dealing with similar situations. I've started writing about family financial boundaries and emotional manipulation, and I'm considering developing workshops for people who want to establish healthier relationships with family members who've taken advantage of their generosity. The hardest part of this entire experience hasn't been the financial loss or even the family conflict. It's been grieving the relationship I thought I had with my parents and brother. I'd believed that we were a close, loving family that supported each other through difficulties. Discovering that this closeness was actually a one-way street, that my love and sacrifice were being exploited rather than appreciated, required mourning the family I thought I belonged to. But this grief has also been liberating. I no longer have to exhaust myself trying to earn love that was never actually available. I don't have to prove my worth through constant sacrifice or maintain relationships that drain my energy without providing genuine support in return. I can invest my time and resources in people who see my full humanity and value me for who I am, rather than what I can provide. If you're watching this and recognizing similar patterns in your own family relationships, I want you to know that you're not alone and you're not crazy. Financial manipulation and emotional exploitation within families is more common than we talk about, and it often happens to the most generous and loving family members. Your worth isn't determined by how much you can sacrifice or how useful you can be to others. You have the right to expect honesty, respect, and genuine care from the people who claim to love you. You have the right to boundaries that protect your well-being, even if those boundaries make other people uncomfortable. You have the right to relationships that support your growth rather than limiting it, that celebrate your success rather than exploiting it. Establishing these boundaries isn't easy, and it often comes with significant costs. Some family members will never be able to accept a relationship based on mutual respect rather than your service to their needs. But the alternative, continuing to sacrifice your well-being for people who don't reciprocate your care, is ultimately more costly to your mental health, financial security, and personal growth. The most important thing I've learned is that healing happens when you stop trying to fix people who don't want to change and start investing in relationships with people who already know how to love well. Your family of origin doesn't have to be your family of choice, and you can create the loving, supportive relationships you deserve with people who've demonstrated their ability to show up for you consistently. I'd love to hear from others who've dealt with similar family dynamics. How did you recognize the patterns? What helped you establish boundaries? What resources supported you through the process of changing these relationships? Your stories and insights could help someone else who's struggling with similar situations, so please share them in the comments. And if you found this story helpful or recognizable, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'll be sharing more content about family boundaries, financial manipulation, and building healthy relationships. You deserve to be surrounded by people who genuinely care about your well-being, and I hope my experience can help you create those relationships in your own life.